Oh my goodness. Okay. I am so excited for this episode. This is like one of my favorite things to talk about vampires, but especially gay vampires. So I'm so excited that you recommended we discuss this movie because also this is our second non-American movie on the podcast. Season three, and
Yeah.
we've only covered two non-American movies. Though it did occur to me, I was thinking about this. We used to like to, put in clips. I was like, how did we do End of Eternity? How did we
I
put
think we
clips
did
into
not
that?
do any at least I didn't like put any audio clips, but I
Yeah.
did put in like video clips on the social media because those have the subtitles on
Yeah.
them.
I'm also like, I will find moments of music and sound design potentially, I guess, that we like. But anyway, I just wanted to say that because I've been like vibrating all day just thinking about like, ooh, and then there's this thing that we could discuss in this perspective or then this imagery and
Well,
what
first fun fact of the episode, the pornographic film that Jean Rollin met Brigitte Lahaine was called Vibration Sexuelle. So vibrations, sexual vibrations, are very much in the mix of his filmmaking.
do you speak French? Because I am
Un
horrible.
peu.
I am gonna be so bad with any pronunciations. Um,
Unfortunately, whenever I try and speak French, I put on an overblown attitude of theatricality. So,
isn't
um,
that the way you do it though? Like
mais bien sûr.
anyone,
C'est la langue de l'amour.
any iconic accent, especially countries that have had, let's say, a lot of impact in shaping the world. I feel like it's what I'm trying to say is I feel like it's fine to be over dramatic with the accents of colonizers.
I mean, I do think it's a common thing folks are saying these days, being like, are we going to look back and cringe at our Italian accents? And I'm like, I can't get more colonizer than the Italians, you know? But I suppose there's an argument to be made about, uh, you know, ethnic groups within, the U.S. context, and
Yeah.
that guy doing the spicy meatball, uh, attitude on all of the pizza boxes is like, would be recognized as like an Italian immigrant to America, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Are
uh,
you are you good with accents at all, Fabiola? I feel like I've
Absolutely not.
yeah.
Absolutely not. No.
and
I don't think I've like ever even tried because I just know it's bad.
Yeah. I have done like audio dramas and like acting and stuff and I'm like don't ask me to do any voice other than my own voice. Well, I mean, I can do affects and I can do pitch my voice up or down, but it's like I know some people who like, when they do a Shakespeare, they're like, "Well, I'll do a British accent." And I'm like, "How do you just pull that out?"
I definitely I recently got Austrian citizenship, so now I'm trying to learn German. And I
Oh,
took like one German
cool.
class, and they were like, "You're talking in a French accent because you took French classes." And so now I'm wondering, because I've been Duolingoing, whether my French sounds, German. We'll see.
That's so interesting. Yeah, we had a friend in college who took German, and so and I also we also took German film classes together. But I can't. That's a language that I'm like. I learned Spanish in high school, so I kind of know romance language blocks stuff. German, I'm like, and I have German. My family is German, but I don't understand any of that.
I just listened to Werner Herzog's autobiography, and it was read by him. So I have been like, I've had the Werner Herzog voice in my head, and that he has a very Bavarian accent, actually, but
Mm.
it's pretty iconic. And actually, the connection to Fascination with Werner Herzog is his film Nosferatu was apparently a bit of an influence, and I think like aesthetically, they have a lot in common with the music and the way it's shot. But I mean, I think spoiler alert, like I'm a big spooky movie guy, and like I didn't understand how absent horror movies were in the French context, but the European context, like more broadly. So, like Jean Rollin is really considered like was considered for a long time like France's only horror movie director, and so I kind of think Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, which is like harkening back and doing an homage to the German Expressionism.
Yeah.
I feel like it feels like a weird random movie, but like there wasn't that much European horror being made in the 70s.
That's I didn't know that, because yeah, in my brain I'm like, so much of like early German expressionism is like the root of so much, I mean, so much style and so much, but so much horror in my brain. I'm like, that's the root of it. But yeah, I guess really like the most stuff is American or British, huh? We should get into doing our intro. Fabiola, how do we do this? You haven't spoken much yet. Would you like to start us off?
I could do the intro to the movie. So today we're talking about Fascination with her special guest Jonathan.
Yes.
Who Saffron knows.
Welcome. Yes. Jonathan,
hello?
You actually suggested we discuss this movie. And I'm curious, what was your like interest in bringing it to this podcast in a discussion of camp, I guess?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you both for having me. This is my first time on a podcast and I'm super nervous. So, but I'm very excited and I love what you do. So, Saffron, you and I know each other from the Grand Illusion in Seattle, and we're both movie freaks. And I think we really connected when I was doing a private screening of Mandy, which was really great. And you kind of threw out to our group Discord, like, if anybody's interested, I do this great podcast, and so we got to talking, about whether you were looking for guests, and you asked me to send you a list of films that might be interesting to talk about, and I think as far as like camp goes, I haven't watched I haven't been aware of Jean Rollin for that long, a few years, but I think his movies are are so beautifully earnest, and so hindered by budget. They were totally ignored and derided by all of the critics, and got a reappraisal by international audiences. And while I think they this is one of the most male gazy films ever, it is dealing with queer themes, right? I mean, lesbianism and whatnot is a big theme, and so I thought that fit into what you do a little bit. But I also think it's a little different. It's kind of it's in its own category, because while most horror movies are gothic, which comes from the British, the English tradition, Jean Rollin's films are, part of the fantastique movement, which I've always found. I took a class in college on the fantastique, and I find it kind of challenging. And I'd love to, at some point in our discussion, talk about like what the fantastique means. But I find I always find the unfamiliar familiar to be really exciting to talk about. And I think, the fantastique elements are really different and but kind of similar. And I thought this could be really an opportunity to like, I just want to talk about it. I want to talk about this
Yeah.
film because there's just like, on the one hand, it's like, this is a kind of trashy, it's low budget, it's kind of boring, but at the same time, there's like actually kind of a lot there. And this is like extremely earnest filmmaking,
Yeah.
you know?
And Fabiola, I'm curious because we actually watched Lips of Blood, which is another Jean Rollin. How do you
Rolla,
say Rolla?
Rolla.
Roll. I'm gonna be awful with the pronunciation the whole time. Uh, we watched Lips of Blood like a while ago. Have you seen, like, what was your familiarity with this director and his works?
Think this might be my third Jean Rollin movie that I've seen. And I partly say I think because he has like a really distinct style and all of his movies kind of blend together. Like not just visually, but they're also kind of all about vampires as well. He kind of makes the same movie over and over again, but they're all different. It's hard
Yeah.
to explain.
Yeah. Well, I love the lesbian vampire trope. I'm like, I don't know. I think probably it was because I watched Buffy when I was younger, and then as I was like coming and like becoming kind of like more confident in my own sexuality, I like already liked vampires, and I was like, this is an interesting vehicle to explore like kind of being an outsider and, you know, being this like sexualized being. So I have researched a lot about lesbian vampires, and so I've brought some of that perspective to this conversation, as well as I did find an interview with Rola on I, which was like, it's a basically a digitalized version of, it was a print magazine, and I don't know how this old website is still up, but I have some interview quotes, which was very cool and exciting to find. But let's do maybe a plot summary, and then we could also talk more about like the production context of this movie. I also know, Jonathan, do you watch, you said you were telling me before that you watched the commentary of this movie
Mm-hmm.
too, which
Yeah,
sounds
I
cool.
would definitely shout out the Powerhouse Indicator film restoration and boutique Blu-ray company. It's a British company, and I have to say, like, it just looks gorgeous on it. And I listened to the commentary on that, and I checked out all the materials, and I did some research here and there. But it's definitely a beautiful way of watching his films. The Redemption discs, which is another Blu-ray company, is what most of his stuff was released on before, and those are great too. But the Indicator stuff came with like some beautiful packaging. Oh, I'm blurry, but like some beautiful
Yeah.
packaging, and it actually came with the original Jean. What is it? The original story in the booklet too.
Oh.
That it's based on. So that was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and online, I'll say that, which because I couldn't get my goddamn remote to work, but I had to watch it online. But there's a really good version online too, because it's the Kino Film Collection, which is partnered with Amazon Prime. So I'd use Prime,
Eh.
but I got a free trial. So, and gosh, I'm shout out to the small like distributors who are keeping these like gorgeous restorations of older films like going.
Absolutely. And they've released a few, the Indicators released a few of his other films. I like Fascination's actually not my favorite of his, but I do think it's like his most well known and his most iconic. But Night of the Hunted, I just got recently, and it's like chef's kiss. It's just gorgeous.
Fabiola, what's the plot of this film?
So, Fascination mainly follows this guy, Mark, who's robbing these people. And it's also the early 1900s, which I want to touch on
1905.
later. Yeah,
Yeah.
1905. Like at the beginning, they specifically say on this April day, 1905. But yeah, so Mark is stealing this gold from this group of people, and as he's running away, he stumbles upon this chateau building, and he like runs in and believes himself that he's like taking these two women hostage, Elizabeth and Ava, who are like the main vampire girls of the movie, but it turns out that they might be the ones taking him hostage, actually.
Yeah.
And it goes on from there.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this movie in terms of like being a vampire movie is that it is a movie that isn't, it's not supernatural. It's not like they're vampires in the sense that they drink blood, but they're not called vampires. But because there's like, this is like the thing that is kind of in the zeitgeist, it's like part of the vampire exploitation genre. Also, it's, we should add real quick, this is like, this is this, there's a lot of sex in this movie. It's absolutely like a like sexploitation movie, and that kind of, you know, low budget and mass appeal aspect of it. Like, we've talked about how exploitation films are camp before.
Yeah.
And but I do think this is the film, this might, I think it ties Female Trouble with the most sex in a movie we've watched for the pod.
Yeah, maybe. At least most nudity, probably.
Yeah.
Jean loves his sheer robes. There's always a sheer robe somewhere.
On the subject of is it a vampire movie, I did, you had said, oh, I'd love a lesbian vampire movie, and I was like, oh, what about Fascination? And this is actually kind of his, it's an homage to vampire lesbian movies, but
Yeah.
they're not actually lesbians. But he was already known at this point as the vampire lesbian guy, right?
Yeah.
He had done forgive me, you know, The Rape of the Vampire, The Nude Vampire, The Shiver of the Vampire, Requiem for a Vampire, all before this movie, all of which
Yeah.
are lesbian vampire
Yeah.
movies.
Shiver
And
of the
this,
Vampires,
yeah,
the other that I've also seen, and that one also has the sheer robes.
I'm planning to watch, I want to watch all of his now. I also heard good things about The Living Dead Girl, which he did after this.
I would say Living Dead Girl or The Iron Rose are my favorite of his.
Yeah, Iron Rose, that's the one where it, I think I read in this interview that he describes it as his Romeo and Juliet.
It's just like an hour and a half or like 80 minutes of like making out in a graveyard, and it's like here for it, you know.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to talk about like his style, but like I just love in Living Dead Girl and Iron Rose and this, all of the long shots where like you see them like just a still camera long shot of the scene, and the characters see their full bodies in the scene doing things.
Yeah.
I think he's like really, I don't know, it's just an iconic style.
Oh, there's also something to, there was something about the camera movement in this movie that felt very, it felt very modern and yet very timeless at the same time. It's 120 minutes, you know, it's 80 minutes. It's pretty short, but it's also a very slow paced movie. Not a lot really happens. There's only a handful of characters, and it's like scene, oh, stuff is happening and then there's sex. Oh, then stuff is happening and then there's sex. And then stuff is happening and then there's sex. But there was like this one camera movement that was so interesting to me, is when he was first coming, Mark was first coming into the chateau, and I can't remember which of the two girls he sees, but like he's like, it's like
I think
he's coming.
Elizabeth is the first one.
Yeah, and it's like,
The reaction shot.
yeah, well, it's like he's coming up this. It's like it's like this still static frame of like him coming up the stairs, and then it's movement, and then it starts like it transitions to handheld or something, like as he's like running and chasing after one of the girls and is like running down the stairs. It's just like was really interesting because it was not expecting this, like the following of the characters, and I don't really have a comment on that other than I liked it. It was a cool camera movement moment.
I mean, in general, Jean Rollin is kind of criticized for his lack of movement of the camera itself. He does do
Yeah.
some zooms, but when I watched Rape of the Vampire and some of the criticism of it, someone said that each shot feels artistic and like beautiful in and of itself, but it feels kind of disconnected from the rest of the movie. And I think like his
Yes.
editing has received a lot of criticism too. I think that like and we should talk about like the phantasmagoric dreamlike elements of this. Part of it feels like each shot is like doesn't necessarily quite connect to the next one really seamlessly. So it's like kind of can feel a little like a bunch of disconnected images together. And I think that kind of I love that it's like and like the way the movie opens up with a painting, I think makes a lot of sense because it feels very much like slow motion painting, like romantic art.
Mm.
You know.
That this reminds me, this is probably a good moment to actually say a quote from this interview from the director, where he was basically asked like, you're noted for imagery but not your narratives, and he said, the imagery in my films is certainly more important than the story itself, but the stories are done to provoke such images. In a certain way, the stories are mad love stories and the images are surrealist visions. The mixture of both makes my films.
Yeah, I do think that definitely comes across in Fascination. Like all of the shots are gorgeous,
Oh my god.
but I also did get the sense that the weird editing and the prioritization of the shots over the story was deliberate.
Yeah.
Like I do feel like he was doing all of that on purpose.
Yeah.
And as far as camp goes, I mean, there's the Sontag, like the lie that tells the truth, and the theatricality element, where it's like, the theatrics of it is more true to life and in that sort of a Lacanian like reality of getting at the truth of the emotion, rather than getting hung up on the details, not letting the plot get in the way of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I watched this last night, and I watched it with my friend Dia, and we were talking about it because we kind of had differing emotion, like kind of feelings towards the end of it. And I ultimately, kind of on this idea of like, how do we feel about the sexuality of this movie, of like, is it fetishistic of showing, these female bodies, and showing also like, these like lesbian sex scenes and like women kissing and being romantic together, and when I was thinking about it, I was like, this, I can, I understand potentially, being uncomfortable or not enjoying it, but to me, I'm like, I know that this is what the movie is. The movie is about looking at this imagery and looking at imagery of women, like sexualized women, and I think the film and the director knows that that's what it is, and so I'm like, I don't mind it, because also like he worked with the same actors over and over again. He was friends with them. It's not that it's, and also like it's that's the industry. Like it's not like it's, how do I put this? I really am like, I don't mind sexploitation films because it's like, that's the genre that it is, and it's really also, it's good, interesting imagery. So I'm like, and then also the camp of it all is like, okay, well then, how, if it's just this simple movie of like, look at all these cool images and also like images of women, kissing each other and stuff, then the camp is finding like pulling apart meaning and something deeper from that.
Yeah, I'm like a known proponent of the male gaze. I believe in reclaiming it. And but yeah, and like specifically sexploitation films, the fetishism is the point. Like it wouldn't be sexploitation without that aspect of it. And in relation to camp, I feel like this discussion and deconstruction of that imagery like is what aids camp, basically, like what you were saying.
And perhaps I can fill in a little bit of the context on the production because I think it
Mm,
applies to this. So, France was undergoing the sexual revolution, and after student protests and whatnot, X-rated films became legal and became very profitable. And so Jean Rollin made these fantastique movies, and they did not do well,
mm.
right? These films that are fantastique, gothic, they made no money, but it was his sort of passion, and so he ended up being a hardcore pornography director during that time, but he hated it and thought they had no artistic value. And he's known for in this movie and in other movies, he would actually let his like cameraman. He was kind of shy and would be like, "Okay, we're filming the sex scene. Cameraman, you take over. I'm gonna leave the room." But he talks about how he worked in pornographic films in order to finance these, which he saw as his artistic movies.
Yeah.
So while we're looking at this as exploitation movies, I think to him, this would have been his artistic movie, and everything else was his cash-ins. And these films, the goth, the fantastique films, they like never made any money, but he had something he wanted to put out into the world. And I do think that he has this particular fascination with the female nude. And so I think that comes across in all the cinematography, and that he like loves naked women on film and wants to put them up there. But uh, I do think like in this film, he's really trying to stick it to the man in a way as far as the sexual politics go. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious how this chauvinist throughout the movie keeps on like thinking he is in power, and it's like, no, you're a figure of ridicule. And I'd love to like get into blow by blow on that because I think
Yeah.
like that's really interesting. But I think it's really the high culture, high art, low art of this movie is, again, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about it as camp, because in a way it's almost like he's trying to do high art. This is his high art piece, So this
Yeah.
isn't his cash in, which is unlike a lot of the exploitation I really like, where it's like everybody knew were making exploitation, and we're not even going to keep the film print because it's garbage and it's just meant to make a buck. And then people like Quentin Tarantino later are like, let's reevaluate the aesthetics of exploitation and find the artistic merit in it. It's like, no, this guy he was trying and kind of failing to like be high art in this movie.
Yeah. I real quick, another quote that I read is that he, in the interview, he did also say, for me, a naked girl is more interesting for sensuality and for poetry. A naked girl is always poetry.
And
So yeah.
something they
Everything he says is so earnest.
Yeah. This, I mean, that's also so, that adds to this like naive camp of being like, this is art, this is so gorgeous and so like profound, and people are like, you made a film with titties. That's it's is this art or is this trash? And it's like, why not both?
And he
Yeah.
said that he's able to write dialogue for women, but really found difficulty writing dialogue for men. And so I do feel like there is I think we could look at this, as far as gender and gender fluidity or gender queerness, because I do think there is some kind of a complicated relationship of this auteur with gender.
Yeah. Yeah.
The women definitely get the best lines in this film.
Oh my god. There is a line that might be the hottest line I've ever heard in a lesbian vampire movie. I
Is
the
it the last one?
it's the one where is it the last line? It's like near the end where Helen says you're beautiful like that with his blood on your lips.
Yeah,
Come
that's
to
the
a
last
bed.
line of the movie, I think.
Oh. Oh. Yeah, but let's get into the kind of the details of like how the power dynamics and gender of this movie, because it really is interesting. Cause so the main, there's Mark, who's this like thief and has this gold, and then the two women, the blonde is Ava, and the brunette is Elizabeth, and then there's a bunch of other women. Well, it ends up being 7 of them total, so like 5 other women come later, and one of them is Helen, and she's like kind of the leader of this group of aristocratic women, and they drink blood, like that's their thing. But it's all like, we have this opening scene of them in the slaughterhouse where they're drinking the ox blood, but it isn't until the end that we kind of find out. Like, you can guess that they probably drink human blood, but they just keep hinting the entire time, oh, something's coming, oh, something's happening at midnight, death is coming. And yeah, Mark just laughs it off the entire time.
So an element of the fantastique that I find really interesting is epistemological uncertainty, which is kind of different from the Gothic. It's an element. One of the first stories I read of the fantastique was like, oh, there's this classical statue, and I kind of think it's alive. I kind of think it's alive, but they never quite resolve whether it's supernatural or not. And so while the Gothic is all about ultimately integrating the supernatural, so like the vampire is like trying to buy some real estate in London, yeah, or in Britain, he's and like this, supernatural Frankenstein is like integrated into the real, and it's like, oh, it is actually real. Whereas the fantastique likes to leave its audiences uncertain. And so throughout Fascination, I felt like Mark constantly thinks he is in power and that he's safe and that he is able to dictate the sexual relations. But he's such a fucking idiot. He thinks he doesn't realize he's like in danger, like Ralph Wiggum on the bus. And so I feel like constantly throughout the film there are these moments where the power dynamics are like in this moment of uncertainty about who has it. And I think games and the notion of play and games is ultimately like the vehicle for that uncertainty. And I'd love to get into that too.
Yeah, in my Letterboxd review, I compared it to Challengers in the sense that everyone here thinks everything is a game, but it's also not a game.
I you I can't, like, I would not have made that connection, and I'm like, wait, you're kind of so real. That's so real, because it's also like kind of, it's like a love triangle, but it's also like part of the the relationship between like Elizabeth and Ava and Mark is like it's not just about them, it's also about the ritual and the practice of, which like in Challengers it's the game of tennis, but it's like in this movie it's like drinking blood, and it's like, what is that their priority? Like, what is the priority, their relationship with the other person or their call to the blood?
Or another Ready or Not, I would say, could be another like movie where it's like, oh, we're all playing a game, and I think
Mm,
ultimately it's like, well, whose game are you playing, right?
yeah.
And Mark says constantly to the two to Ava and Brigitte, or sorry,
Brigitte,
Ava
yeah.
and Elizabeth, yes.
Is wait, is Brigitte, no, Brigitte plays Ava, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, you're just playing a game with me, but now the games are over. And he keeps on like insisting that they're playing a game, and that, you know, that that's okay, because the only way women can like have power is like in a dominance play where like they're being allowed to pretend they have power. But it's like, no, dude, you're not you're not playing their game. Sorry, they're not playing your game, you're playing their game. And then
Yeah.
ultimately Hélène, who's kind of in charge, who is clearly the aristocrat, it's her game that everyone's playing.
Mm,
And I do think that this goes back to the aristocracy of France, right? So like
yeah.
parlor games were something that were like for the idle rich. And there were all of these masquerade kind of games where people would put on different roles, and it's like, oh, we can pretend, you know, we can talk with the king in a masquerade ball and pretend like we're equals, but ultimately, no, we're not equals. And I do think that that is like the kind of legacy of games that like this all exists in.
Yeah. I mean, there is even a moment kind of that, like there's a moment that there's an awareness of kind of the class divide too in the movie,
Yes.
because Mark he's like stolen the money and escaped from this other group of thieves, and they kind of are like trying to get into the castle, and then Ava ends up killing all of, yeah, she kills all of them, doesn't she? With her scythe. That's that whole scene. But then Mark finds one of the one female thief, and he gets really upset, and that's when he's finally like, okay, the game's over. I'm not, I want to leave now. And he's like, oh, you think you all, oh, this because she's just a common girl that you can kill her because you're aristocrats. Like, I'm a common person too. Like, this isn't fair. And that's also really interesting to me, is this like kind of this moment of like, ooh, is there like a little bit of politics in here, but it's overshadowed by like that isn't really explored to its full potential, because that's not the point of the movie really. It's the aesthetics, and then that is how, I guess, like it's not the language and the plot, it's the aesthetics, and that's what's exploring the politics.
So I think that there are two characters, or three characters really, all of whom it's like who's playing whose games. And I think, you know, certainly Mark, there's this sort of dandyism where it's like
Mm,
nothing is true, everything is permitted. I'm gonna turn on my thieves because I'm gonna play games with them, and it's like an almost existential, like break free of the system kind of character that's kind of romantic in its own way. But then it's like, oh no, you're playing the chambermaids games, and it's like, oh, are Ava and Elizabeth, do they have the power? And ultimately, like, ultimately the tables get turned on them, right? Like
yeah.
the chamber, like they get eaten by the rich,
Yeah.
right? And I think that the French audiences of this time would have 100%, they probably would have seen the class critique maybe more even than like the sexual and gender critique, because I think it's pretty clear that like, oh, as soon as, even though it's one of their own, she's a different class. And so when Elizabeth gets slashed up a little bit, all of the rich women just immediately turn on her and drink her blood.
Yeah.
And they are drinking blood as a health tonic to look more beautiful. Like it's ultimately everybody's playing, all of these different dynamics, all of these different games. It ultimately comes down to class, and everybody is actually playing the game of Alain and the upper classes and the bourgeoisie.
I hadn't really even put it together that, like, yeah, part of them drinking blood, it's like, oh, it's a cure for the anemia, but that's also just like, it's about being a presentation of health and beauty. And that's so, I mean, I know you just said, like, oh, it's all about class, but I'm like, ooh, still the gender of that too is so interesting, because it's like, oh, oh, we're these delicate, beautiful women, and we're drinking out of these glasses, but they're in a slaughterhouse, and what they're drinking is blood. And I love that, like, kind of grotesque femininity of being like, and then when it's midnight, and when they have this bloodlust, they just descend on Elizabeth, and they're just biting and screaming. They're not screaming, I guess, but she's screaming. And I
think it's Ava.
Oh, yes, you're so right.
Excuse me. Yes, it is Ava.
Oh God, they both have E names. Yeah. The blonde.
Yeah.
Yes. I just think Brigitte Lahaye, because she's, kind of a big deal. But
Elizabeth is the one who falls in love with Mark, but is not actually in love with him in the end.
And I'd love to circle back to what the heck is going on with her, because her character, it's like, I think there might be some like madness kind of stuff of like the madness of love, which I think is a little bit different. But just on the subject you put of like that first scene where they're like, look at this butcher's face who breathes in the blood all the time. Look at the hardiness and the health in his face. And he like, there's that shot of him and he's like, and so like, it's interesting to see the aristocrats like lusting after the health and beauty of the working class.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like it's also like not just about health and beauty, but also just the body itself, which the visual language of the film helps enhance with like all the nudity. But like as Helen says, when they sense blood, it's like doesn't matter whose it is, so long as it's like coming from a body. So like any blood is fair game.
I think, I mean, that the kind of second to last line where it's like, blood is the life, which this is spoken by Elizabeth, and she's in the rookery with Mark, and she's like, why? And then she like has just betrayed Ava, and then is just about to betray Mark, and she's like, blood is the life which flows in you, but it's also death when it escapes, a true symbol of life and death. Perhaps there's no going back once it's touched your lips. But you do love me, don't you? I did love you, but remember, you rejected me. I loved Ava, and I killed her. The blood cult is strange and bizarre. The love of blood may be more than that of the body in which it flows. So, like, I do think that Fabiola, you're pointing out that like the blood is a very important symbol that holds a lot here, and I think perhaps it is a symbol that is undefinable. Like it is.
Yeah.
Maybe you can help me unpack it, because I struggle with
it. It feels like it's both the body, but also like as you said, like the madness of love. It feels like both very corporeal, but also like as you said, undefinable. Like not even Elizabeth can really define it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, like blood is bodies. We're our physical bodies, our presence in the world, and that as our bodies, that is a representation of gender and class. And then blood is also physical. It's what is flowing through you. But blood has such a like spiritual, and it can be so representative throughout history of more than just more than just the body, even though it's like blood is able to be this, like, the thing that connects the body to the emotions and feelings and desires. And so, yeah, I think, like, the desire for the blood, and, like, it's just pure emotion, desire, joy, like, lust. It is the representative of all of those complex emotions, and it, when you have drunk it, when it's overtaken you, it doesn't, everything else doesn't matter. The body doesn't matter. It's just about, and it's consuming it too, is, like, that is a destructive act. That's why blood is it's why she says it's life and it's death, because blood is what makes someone alive, but drinking it is what kills it, and spilling it is what kills it and destroys life.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this makes me think of the legacy of World War II and eugenics, this notion of pure blood, and and I think ultimately it's like a will to, it's like, all this talk is worthless. What actually has the power is the will to power, violence, right? That, we can talk about all the games we play, but ultimately, who's in charge? The person who is willing to enact violence. And Mark ultimately is unwilling to be violent, but Hélène has no problem, inflicting violence even on one of her own team.
Yeah.
And I think that reminds me a lot of the sort of fascistic quality of capitalism, and the fragility of the body. And all of this that we're talking about really is falls under, like, body horror, which, I've heard defined as there's more, the body is the origin of meaning, and there's more meaning in signified than shown in the signifier. And I think, like, the blood is that wealth of meaning that kind of flows from the body in this case. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's maybe now's a good time for me to bring up Andrea Weiss, who is kind of like the person seems cited the most in discussions of lesbian vampires as a trope. 1992, she published Vampires and Violets, Lesbians in the Cinema, and had an entire chapter on the vampire lovers as a concept. And her main critique is that the lesbian vampire is a representation of men's fears about feminism and sexually empowered women, and that, the films are catering to male heterosexual fantasies, which is also I've seen, contested, and other people be like, well, let's, is that true? Is that actually, Fabiola introduced me to the work of Annie Rose Malamet, who is so cool.
Yeah.
She is a
Girl
Icon.
Scouts and Giallo, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and she has two lovely talks that were like presentations that were at the Final Girls Berlin Film Festival. That was, both of those are online, and talks about how, like, the perspective of being a lesbian and a leather dyke, and talking about these things that some, like, queer and feminist theorists are like, oh, this is, sadomasochistic imagery, that's a male desire and a male heterosexual thing. And it's like, well, no, this is also a queer lesbian perspective and interested in these themes. And, I feel like Fascination, this movie, is so interesting because, I don't know, it's just there's all this, like, interesting stuff here with the talking about blood and talking about stuff. And I feel like, even though I respect Andrea Weiss, her just saying, she had a quote that was just like, Rolla directed a series of surrealist French horror films, all of which sacrifice narrative coherence for shocking sadomasochistic lesbian imagery. It's just like, that's how she just describes them. And it's like, no, but there's, like, blood is so much more than just a man's fear of menstruation.
I mean, I think Barbara Creed in The Monstrous Feminine talks a lot about
Yeah.
this, and sort of the unable to define something that is like, if it's like, if you want to make it scary, just make it wet, and like menstrual blood, and also just like goopiness and things like that, like that inability to define the boundaries of where something begins and ends is like scary to patriarchal notions of identity. And I think what we're saying about the blood just fits really, really well into that.
Yeah, my note is I always think it's a little interesting when if it's like, oh, if it's like period blood, that's a patriarchal and a male heterosexual fear, and I'm like, look, I get grossed out by my period blood, and I'm a queer woman. I think it's fine to be goopy and gross. I don't know. It's a criticism I see with people being like, Cronenberg is all of his body horror is like coming from this turning the female body grotesque, and I'm like, yeah, but the female body is grotesque.
And also, it
Well,
just feels like a weird simplification of something that, like, as we've discussed in this recording, it can hold so many meanings. I wouldn't like automatically go to period blood.
Yeah.
so I got the newest version of The Monstrous Feminine, and in her new essay, she talks about the radical monstrous feminine, which is some of the criticisms you're describing is like, oh, so the woman being monstrous is like still within the boundaries of patriarchy and whatnot. And I feel like the new reading of it is actually this monstrous feminine is outside of it, and that's actually what makes it scary. And because it's like, and films like Titane, for example, it's like, no, I'm not, I'm something else, right?
Yeah.
And I think Cronenberg's work too, he says, no, I'm not about like gay sex or straight sex. It's like the new flesh, and it's looking at something beyond patriarchal system. And I think there's a lot of frustration of being like, we just can't escape the bounds of language, Derrida, paging Derrida, but it's like, no, I think there's we do have the opportunity for looking for something new, for something beyond. And like, I think seeing a lot of these monstrous feminines that like destroy patriarchal structures, and you're like, fuck yeah, you're like, that they are in fact kind of hopeful in a way.
Yeah.
And empowering.
I also want to say, even though I started by going, I don't really agree with Andrea Weiss, in finally, reading the chapter, finally reading Vampires and Violets, and after hearing people quote it in so many like video essays and stuff that I've seen, reading it, I discovered she ends her chapter on the vampire lovers talking about camp. And I was like, oh my goodness, she did it. Like, we were already going to be discussing this film in context of camp, and then I was like, there's a academic scholar who's already talking about vampire, like lesbian vampires in relation to camp, where she says, quote, due to her unique position, the lesbian spectator doesn't develop a fear of the vampire, and of course, as a horror film, it then falls flat. Without the element of danger, the film becomes a burlesque to be appreciated primarily as camp. And basically goes on to say that, like, if you're reading camp through the lens of like irony, theatricality, and humor, there is this like, there can be this irony and humor to watching this movie that is like, stories about monstrous women, and being like, no, that's empowering to me, and that is like, potentially having an experience that is contradictory than a director's intentions. And I don't think this is actually even the case with Fascination, but like maybe some of the more like the Hammer horror lesbian that trilogy of lesbian vampire movies and, you know, some of the other low budget, like even more pornographic stuff, it's like watching it and being like, it taking a different reading for it is, I think, camping the lesbian vampire as a concept. And I was like, damn, I'm okay. Okay, Andrea, I've come back around. I'm on your side.
I feel like another aspect of camp in this film is related to the setting, which I like took a mental note of like, oh, 1905. And that is more or less the era of Art Nouveau, which is mentioned in Sontag Notes on Camp. But yeah, Art Nouveau is basically this movement that was late 1800s, early 1900s, where the art is, it feels like the midpoint between like classical art and modern art, in the sense that like all of the proportions are more or less there, but it's also kind of flat and almost comic strip looking.
Mm.
It was
It's
also
like
very,
stained glass
yeah,
in
and it
its
was also
flatness.
very like influential in furniture and home decorations, which it just feels interesting how this film that's supposed to be like this exploitation horror film also has the vibes of antique furniture,
Yeah.
and it like not in a spooky way but in a like pretty art movement way.
Go on.
Another quote real quick from the director saying that his idea, like the starting idea he had for this movie was to give the lead actress Bridget just a costume. He wanted to put her in a fun costume. Like he's like, "Oh, let me pick 1905 because I want to put her in a fun historical costume."
Yeah, I found in my viewing habits, like I just am finding more and more as I get it more and more, I just like am focused on the production design of movies, and I feel like that's one of the reasons I've kind of the breakthroughs I had with Roland is there's just kind of so much there. But and I do think that like Art Nouveau, like I love the typeface, I love all of the intricate details, I love the like it definitely is like harkening back to the romanticism and is kind of an attempt at something new that isn't just neoclassical. And I love the, you know, the French subway signs and things like that. It's very French. But something I thought that relates to this is the chateau itself and
Mm.
the Gothic castle. When I in general in Gothic literature, British Gothic literature, it's like, oh, there's always going to be a Gothic castle, and it's all crumbling, and it's like the base reading is like, oh, it's a reflection of the character's mad mind and whatnot. Whereas in general, fantastique is allowed to be in more contemporary, normal settings. But this movie is, you know, this was shot at the Chateau de Meaux in France over 10 days. And it's a beautiful castle. You can like get married there and stuff. And so there are lots of goth couples who are like doing the scythe thing. Um, but it's kind of a gothic castle, but it's not really a gothic castle. It's kind of working in a different way. I think it's
Yeah.
actually like, so the legacy of chateaus was during the reign of Louis XIV. He built Versailles, and then all of the rich aristocrats built all of these chateaus as demonstrations like that are away from everything else, and they are kind of demonstrations of their power. They're filled with mirrors, and like this kind of reminds me of our conversation about games and like the games that aristocrats are playing and this kind of artificiality. That's really different than the Gothic castle, which was like the British Byron and Shelley romanticism, where it's like those British aristocrats paid to have their stuff look like, to make gardens that looked like they were crumbling neoclassical monuments. And so those are very different, right? And so I
Yeah.
kind of, while this is like a castle, I felt that this, it's kind of almost like it's not a castle, baby, it's a chateau.
Yeah.
um and I feel like it worked in a little bit of a different way. What did you guys think of the setting and the
Yeah, like
castle?
it's not exactly crumbling. It looks well managed, especially on the inside. Like it just looks like a contemporary to 1905
Yeah.
building.
To me, I think what I actually found interesting is like, yeah, it's really it's not dark and gloomy at all.
There's a
It's
lot of florals.
yeah, and it's very warm, honestly. I mean, they have like a nice roaring fire in the fireplace and like all the rooms, and to me, what the setting came to mind to me is it really felt like it added to how unaware Mark was in my brain, because it was like, oh, there's this abandoned chateau castle I'm gonna hide away in. And it's like, people are living here, dude. Like, this is their place. They've got it all set up. I didn't really know.
And he falls into the trap.
Yeah.
Yeah, like because it looks so unassuming, like it's not like spooky looking, therefore it's like deceiving.
And I
Yeah.
feel like the bridge is kind of the most iconic part of the chateau, and like
Yeah.
that can represent like its isolation from the rest of the world, which if you go back to like Versailles, the whole idea was like, by isolating the aristocracy, and taking the center of power away from Paris, I can maintain control. And I feel like this chateau, by isolating Mark, they were able to, the aristocrat was the king of their domain, in that kind of like
Mm-hmm.
the romanticizing of the feudal system is kind of what like France did, which was like,
Yeah.
I saw it written about where it's like this story takes place away from society where the women are able to like be lesbians and like have lesbian sex and also practice like devil worship and like murder a commoner for like health and beauty stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important, that sort of like the setting and the isolation there.
Yeah. I also want to add, I feel like in my mind, there's a lot of tropes, a reoccurring trope in lesbian vampire kind of narratives is that there is a straight couple that then this sexually empowered, fluid, woman kind of comes in and tempts them. And that's the Vampire Lovers, which was the first of the Hammer horror trilogy. And then there's
Also
the
Shiver of the Vampires,
yeah.
which is Jean Rollin. From like my vague memory of it, that was the basic plot.
Yeah. Also, that was the case with The Velvet Vampire, which was Stephanie Rothman's lesbian vampire movie that I watched after we discussed Student Nurses, and it was very fun. Quick side note, the thing that's really fun about that movie is that the isolated place that she pulls the couple away from is a remote house in the desert. It's very Californian. Instead of this like, oh, it's this like gothic in the woods and stuff, it's like, we're gonna ride a dune buggy and we're in the desert. Anyway, but the thing with Fascination that I find interesting is that these are women doing their little thing. They're having their own little society, and it's a man coming into it. And that's what I find really interesting is instead of like, it kind of flips the like common narrative of this like sexually empowered woman kind of transgressing into this like, heterosexual, like assumed heterosexual, usually seduces the woman, but relationship. It's like this man kind of coming into the situation that he doesn't understand, and he is mocked for it. And in some ways that feels like it's kind of like, no, like, I at least choose to very much interpret this movie to be like about empowered women, and it's not, and they aren't really. Yes, they're a point of horror because they are drinking blood and there is a criticism of that, but I also think there's a criticism of Mark as a character to think, to criticizing that he thinks that he has control over these women. But I'm curious what you guys think. If you felt like the movie was, I mean, do you is even the movie picking a side? Is it trying to make a point, or is it just giving us beautiful imagery?
I think
I
it's
mean,
mainly beautiful imagery.
I think there's like they show empowered women, right? And they show women being able to like the patriarchal, the man coming in who thinks that just because he's a man, he's in power and gets to dictate like all of the sexual stuff that happens. He's a figure of ridicule, and ultimately, like I think the sexual revolution's here, and like the structures are being destroyed. But then I also think that there is an element of warning being like, but despite the empowerment that these women might feel, in fact, they still are within the structures of capitalism, and that they don't actually have the power, right? Like the chambermaids are in fact still servants of the bourgeoisie that doesn't mind destroying them. And so I think there are a few layers to it. And I wanted to just shout out the book Splatter Capital, which kind of says that splatter films ultimately are kind of anti-capitalist in that they show the fragility of the body and the way, and that in a way we can enjoy violent films in that they are kind of showing that these larger structures of society have the power, and ultimately like these individuals are like extremely frail, under the crushing power of like capitalism.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear if you guys have a favorite or one well, we often do discuss favorite fashion moments in our shows. And so I'm definitely curious if you guys have favorite fashion moments, and also if you just have favorite imagery in general.
I feel like with this film, it's pretty easy. The entire scythe scene.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about that. I feel like it's the most
It's
iconic
incredible.
moment, but
It's incredible.
Yeah, and like the scythe, by the way, is like the perfect Death wields the scythe, and the whole idea is like people are like blades of grass and they can just be cut down incredibly easily. And like the violence of this movie is ridiculous. So I watched this last night with my partner, who is a nurse, and she was like, they would take a lot longer to die. Yeah. And also she loved all of the sheer gowns and whatnot. I think I personally I don't think I would look good in it, but I think that like Mark's dandy outfit is pretty incredible, and Brigitte Lahay's like her after night falls but before midnight outfit that's kind of red is really beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna note, I find it really fun that they're dressed in white at the start of the movie, and they're dressed like in kind of these pale colors, and then as like people start dying and like the kind of darkness is revealed, they are then dressed in red later. Mm,
The
delicious.
scythe outfit is basically a cloth. It's like a black cloth
Yeah.
that she just draped on herself.
Yeah, I love. There's so many moments that I loved. I do think it's at the beginning, but I was a big fan of when they're I can't remember which one of the women it was, but when they're drinking the ox blood, and then she dips her finger in the blood and is like painting her lips like it's lipstick. Loved that. That's also another moment where it's, I think the man, I guess he's like the doctor or something. He's like, this isn't a game. This is a treatment. But it's like, no, it's a game to her, and that's
Scream queen energy. Go on.
yeah.
The scene where Ava is getting consumed by the rest of the women is also a really good scene.
It's a great scene, although it is also my partner was like, they're not even breaking the skin, because they're like, "Nyah, nyah, 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 nyah." So it's kind of ridiculous, but it's also like just beautifully shot.
It's beautifully
Yeah.
shot. Also, okay, the sound in this movie is fascinating to me because I think this must be just like an is this a directorial choice, or is this like an era thing where it's very quiet? Like,
It's definitely an era thing.
like
Because, like, one of the things that I really associate with films from the 70s is just how heavily ADR'd they are and how heavily Foleyed they are.
But like all of the sex scenes, it's the
Oh,
quietest
yeah.
sex scenes I've ever heard. And like it's like
Dead silence.
I don't know, it's kind of, to me I'm like that's also camp where it's like we're seeing sex, but we're not hearing anything. It's really like this is not reality.
It's all about the visual. It's all about the image and the composition.
My partner also was like, those women are not they are not enjoying this sex. Like the lesbian sex is absurd and so male gazy. I do have some information about the score of this. This was Richard Lornak's first score he did, and he composed it using a Korg 700S and a Mellotron. And I was thinking it was a theremin the whole time,
Same.
but it was a musical saw. And he and the director were like, what instrument is representative of like the image of the scythe? And they thought
So
the
cool.
musical saw really worked for it. And so I thought that was really cool.
That's
That
badass.
that was galaxy brained.
I will say I actually I brought up the how the sound design because to me the moment where they're all eating Ava, her screams and cries, I was like, it sounds orgasmic.
Yeah.
And
That's part of why I really like that scene. There's just something about it. And the way like the camera just stays on that image for a
yeah,
long time.
it's honestly like I think that's why the images of this movie make it for me, and I think that's why I enjoy it so much because I'm like, even though I mean I haven't seen as much as you, Jonathan, but I feel like I've probably seen more of these kinds of films than the average viewer, especially horror viewer, and I have yet to see anything quite like the imagery and Fascination anywhere else. Even like Lips of Blood, the only image that really stood out to me was the when the vampires pretend to be nurses and they like pull down their masks and reveal their fangs.
Yeah, I feel like I associate when I think of like genre imagery, I think of women in the 1970s against like an older building background. That's what I think of when I think of Jean Rollin films.
I definitely we touched a little bit on the sort of phantasmagoric nature of all this, and I think a big part of it too is like Roland was going for surrealism for to a certain point. You know, if you go into Scarecrow Video, the section you will find this film at the moment in, they have normally it would be in the Jean Rollin section, but it is in top 10 films to put on at 2 a.m. and pass out to. And I do think
that makes sense.
I do think that, and I also on the Pure Cinema podcast on their one of their all nighters, they listed this as a great film to put on at that weird 3 a.m. time slot, so that you kind of are zoning in and out of consciousness and have a very striking, strange image. And I do think like one of the key elements of surrealism is breaking down the barrier between dreams and reality. And I do feel like the imagery in this and these striking images that are kind of disconnected because the editing kind of makes like each shot is its own kind of world in a way. Like they do feel that sort of dislocation, does kind of make it feel dreamlike. And then within it it's like, is this just my brain having like throwing a bunch of random trash? Is it trash, or does all of the stuff here have meaning? How deep can we actually read into all of this?
Yeah, I love how if we think about all of the eras we've covered with media on this show, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess that it's that's the whole point of camp. It's like what's the imagery that's sticking in your brain, and how are you finding meaning in that?
Yeah.
And I honestly can't think of much more to say other than I'm really glad I watched this film. And thank you so much again, Jonathan.
I'm
For
glad you liked
bringing
it. I
Yeah.
was a
to
little
us.
worried.
Yeah, this was a fun discussion.
I,
And I'll
I,
like anything from the 70s.
me
Yeah.
too. It's my favorite decade.
Oh,
And
you guys need to swap recommendations then. Fabiola really loves the 70s.
It just seems like the best era of filmmaking to me.
yeah, I mean, what are the elements that make you like the 70s more than other decades?
Just something about the quality of the image and the lighting. It
Mhm.
to me, like there's something about it that it peaked in the 70s.
Definitely, I find like the film stock and grain and just way everything looks, I find super compelling. And as soon as it's like the 80s, it's just a totally different look. I love my neon vibes, but like 70s definitely look the best. But I also just, for me, I really like the pessimism of like
Oh yeah.
the failed sexual and cultural revolution. And so like in the 70s, you never quite know whether the heroes are going to die. And
Yeah,
you
there's
know,
like this unpredictability about the 70s.
yeah, and the new Hollywood thing of like, we're breaking down all of the codes about what you can show in movies and what you can't. We're gonna like have, say what you will about the auteurs, like we're gonna have a lot of different kinds of stories. So there's a lot of experimentation, and people actually getting budgets. But it was different in Europe, and I mean, American cinema is not world cinema. So like
Yeah.
I really appreciate the opportunity to like you gave me permission to do a bit of more of a deep dive with Jean Rollin, and I do feel like it's a bit, I hate calling things fractal, but regression, it's got regression, like the deeper you look, the more you see, and the more you
Yeah.
zoom out, the more you see. And I do feel like the first time I watched this movie, I did not like it. I thought it was boring, and I do feel like this reappraisal of genre and exploitation film, is just a wonderful place to explore.
Yeah. Oh, like my taste has changed so much, and I contribute a lot of that to this podcast and like having
It's my
discussions.
fault.
No, it's
It's my
good. I love that you've done this to me. Like this is kind of a tangent, but I was talking to my friend recently about there's this moment in season 6 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where a character nearly rapes another character, and it's this moment of then like it creates this like big character transformation. And I was talking to my friend about it being like, oh, like I think this is like it's really interesting that they made this bold choice even if the actor later said they like regretted it. And my friend was like, I thought you said you didn't like this choice. And I'm like, damn, my taste has really changed in the last couple years, because I'm like, no, like now I find that it's interesting to go kind of the not safe route and made something that like people may have found too intense because it's in service of the character. It wasn't for shock. It wasn't for. But also, I'm like, even I'm okay with people doing stuff for shock. Like, I don't think I'll ever watch the Hostel movies, and I kind of just Eli Roth as a person has gross
Yeah.
politics. But I'm also like, yeah, people should be able to do that and just make shock stuff for like pure, just put stuff out there, because that's like
There's this great Annie Rose lecture where she shows a clip from one of the Hostel movies, and it's
yeah.
really good.
Yeah, no, I want to watch Hostel 2. I don't want to watch. I will pirate Hostel 2 because Hostel 2 seems interesting, because it's like, what does it mean when we're putting women in these situations instead? And I'm like, you probably you can't do it great, but you can do it. At least you tried.
I mean, it's all we keep on reappraising all of this media, and like that particular aughts crop of movies, the so-called torture porn,
Yeah.
was like the pendulum swinging back from like Silence of the Lambs and Scream
Yeah.
and whatnot, and that was them again being like, oh, it's all trash, and a lot of the like horror is just exploit. It was like going back to it being
Yeah.
considered trash and exploitation,
And
and now we're back on the pendulum swinging to
yeah.
elevated horror, and films like Get Out, getting the approval of
Yeah. Oscars.
establishment.
Yeah. Yeah,
But I do
I
hate the way they look. I hate that like, ugh,
yeah.
like, kind of early digital like
Yeah.
look of those films.
CGI blood, worst
Bad.
worst worst thing. Stuff in horror movies I hate the most. CGI blood, because it always looks bad. Anyway, once again pulling out The Art of Cruelty, my favorite, because yeah, there's a lot of
Again,
talk
something
about.
I recommended to you.
Yeah, I this is a good point in if you the listener of this podcast has not listened to our episode on Evil Dead 2 with Dominic. We also talked a lot about horror and the pendulum swings from just having fun and being gory and pulpy to elevated horror. But I also like that this French stuff is it's also on a whole other plane, because it's like dreamlike and vibes.
Yeah. Yeah, more vibes based horror. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Seconded, yeah. I feel
Well,
like we should try and show some Jean Rollin at the Grand Illusion. I think that would be really fun. Because seeing
yes.
this on a big screen, I've never seen his stuff on a big screen, and I do feel like for films that are so vibes based and visual, like seeing it big and not being able to like check your phone definitely would add something. So I think it would be great to see if we can
Yeah,
get a screening.
that's a good idea. Well, I was gonna ask, is there any last things we want to talk about?
Oh, I did want to make kind of an interesting connection, I think. Uh, Keela Janice, who wrote House of Psychotic Women, who
Mm,
uh, uh,
is on my reading list.
focuses on mental illness in genre and exploitation films. When she was at the Beacon to promote House of Psychotic Women, she showed a few films, Secret Ceremony and The Mafu Cage. And her connection to Jean Rollin was when she did her film festival. She brought Jean Rollin to the United States, and he was like, "Oh, I didn't even know I had an audience here," because like his films were like basically disappeared, and it wasn't until like VHS and DVD like got his stuff distributed internationally that there really was a reevaluation. So anyway, she brought him here, but she said about those films, like about Secret Ceremony and The Mafu Cage, in Gothic literature and film, like madness in men is always like shown, like is mirrored in the setting in the crumbling castle. But
Mm,
isn't it interesting that in films where it is a woman with mental illness, they all seem to take place in really interesting apartments and houses that are very intricate and put together, and the production design in Mafu Cage and Secret Ceremony is just out of this world. And so if I see her again, I kind of want to ask, what do you think of the settings in Jean Rollin's films? Because I think the character of Elizabeth, I think she is undergoing kind of a mental crisis, and I think the settings of the chateau are different than the classic Gothic castle. So
yeah.
I would just love to hear what she has to say
Oh,
about that.
that's so interesting.
So if you're listening, Keela, let us know.
Yes. Is there anything you want to shout out, Jonathan? Any things you want to us to link in our episode description? Anything you want to promote?
I'm kind of between creative projects at the moment. You're welcome to follow me online everywhere. I am Genghis Pon, GENGHISPWN. Follow me on Letterboxd. I don't do much social media just because, like, I'm not gonna do work for free for my corporate overlords, and it stresses me out. But I'm a nature photographer. I'm a UX designer, and come see me at the Grand Illusion. Every other Saturday I'm there projecting movies. And please, if you're interested in physical media, consider supporting Scarecrow Video. They're having some difficulties at the moment, and they are the nation's, I believe, largest non-profit video archive, and they're a rental store, and you can rent videos via mail from them. And if you want to find like really hard to find stuff, it's absolutely great. I've been going through the Alicia Betty's VHS top 10 never released on DVD VHS tapes, and some of the bizarre psychotronic stuff I've seen, I just would never get the opportunity to, like, I would never find it without Scarecrow. And again, shout out to Daniel for highlighting Fascination on his top 10 films to pass out to support our Scarecrow.
Long live physical media and vibes-based horror.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you
was really
again.
good. Yeah.
I have been your co-host, Saffron Hefta-Gaub. You can follow me online everywhere at Gaub Hefta.
And I've been your other co-host, Fabiola. You can find me on Instagram at Fabi0LAHH and on Twitter at Fabiola_Liaño.
Our theme song that you're bobbing your head to right now is by Harrison Lurie.
Give us a rating on Spotify and a review on Apple.
Thank you to our patrons, Nicole Veneto, Jose Liano, and Pericles Sparrow. Please check our episode description for additional links and citations.
Thank you so much.